is most appropriate that we have our next speaker here at a major conference on free speech. Juan Williams is one of America's foremost journalists, and he has lived free speech in his career and in his life, and he has unique credentials and perspective from which to speak on this topic. Mr. Williams grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and graduated from Haverford College in 1976, and then began his career at the Washington Post, where he worked for 23 years as a political reporter, editorial writer, national correspondent, columnist, and he was the White House reporter as well. In 1997, Mr. Williams joined Fox News as a news analyst, and he is still with Fox today. In 2000, Mr. Williams joined National Public Radio as a regular contributor, but he is not with NPR today. More on that in a moment. Mr. Williams has been a force of nature in the world of journalism. He has regularly appeared on Nightline, Washington Week in Review, Crossfire, the McNeil Lehrer NewsHour, Capital Gang, and many other programs. He's been a contributor to Fortune magazine, The New Republic, Atlantic Monthly, Ebony, Time, Newsweek, and many other publications. Mr. Williams has written several documentaries, and he won an Emmy for his documentary, From Riot to Recovery. Mr. Williams has interviewed every U.S. president from Ronald Reagan through Barack Obama. He's written books including Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years, Thurgood Marshall, American Revolutionary, and most recently, Muzzled, The Assault on Honest Debate. Mr. Williams has never been reluctant to speak his mind, and last year, doing so on Fox News had him fired by NPR. Mr. Williams' firing was controversial and sparked much debate and strong opinions from many quarters. He has said in his book, Muzzled, that his firing was, quote, political correctness run wild, unquote, and he has called his firing, quote, a chilling assault on free speech, unquote. Mr. Williams has decried the politically slanted news and talk shows that leave, quote, no room for people who want to hear all sides of a debate that leads to some reasoned solution to critical issues of the day, unquote. Well, Mr. Williams, there is room at the City Club, so you have come to the right place. Please welcome to the City Club, Juan Williams.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Hugh, thank you for that warm introduction. And of course, a pleasure to be here for this conference on free speech and discussion of open debate. I must tell you before we get going that I never thought that I would be returning to the City Club under these circumstances. I've been here at the City Club to talk about the civil rights movement in this country, books I've written such as Eyes on the Prize, the biography of Justice Marshall, the first African American on the court, even to talk about a book I wrote on the need for new black leadership in this country, and to have general discussions about journalism. But I never thought I'd be here in this position where I had been labeled a bigot, and the suggestion had been made that anything I say should be between me and a psychiatrist. It's to be the subject of the story, the heart of the controversy, is something that is a real education for me as a journalist. And to tell you the truth, I prefer not to be in this situation. But so be it. I'm reminded, when I used to work for NPR, people used to say to me all the time, they didn't know what I look like, and it's nice to be able to put a face with the voice that they heard over the radio. Now I'm in a situation where people know what I look like as a result of this controversy, and oftentimes now people say to me that it's good to be able to put a body with the talking head. So it's a little different dynamic, if you will. But the discussion here today about free speech is absolutely critical, and I think it is a tribute to the City Club that they would make this the centerpiece of their 100th anniversary, because they have been a beacon to this nation and to the world in terms of allowing people to speak freely and reflecting the temperature of their times. The freedom to speak our mind, to criticize, to challenge each other, to challenge the university, the church, the government, corporations, to challenge media. To me, this is the heart of democratic freedoms, and we can have no solutions to our most important issues in this world, especially here in America today, without freedom of debate and freedom of speech. My story doesn't begin with me. It begins with Bill O'Reilly, the well-known Fox News commentator, opinion personality, talk show host, who was appearing on an ABC show called The View and said, in the course of an interview, "Muslims killed us on 9/11. That prompted two of the co-hosts of The View, Whoopi Goldberg and Joy Behar, to walk off the set in protest. And Mr. O'Reilly then explained that he was only talking about radical Muslims or extremists. The host returned to the set. Barbara Walters said that was inappropriate for them to walk off. It became something of a little set to a brouhaha that was reported in the next day papers. The conservative, strong, dominant O'Reilly taking on the ladies of The View. It was about at that level of conversation and didn't get much attention beyond that. But the next time that Bill O'Reilly had his own show on the Fox News Channel, I was his lead guest, and he began by recounting what had happened to him and asking me, "Juan, where did I go wrong?" And I said to him, "Bill, I'm not going to play politically correct games with you. The fact is that the people who were in those airplanes that crashed into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, into that field in Pennsylvania, the people who directed this act of terror were, in fact, Muslims, and they cited their Islamic faith as justification for the attack. They said they were engaged in jihad." I then went on to say that, in fact, the Times Square bomber, who had recently been in court, said to the court that if America thinks that the war against America, the Islamic war against America, is over, that they are mistaken, that this is what has been seen so far simply amounts to the first drop of blood. And then, speaking 9 years after 9/11, we're today 10 years after that day, I said, "You know, even today, Bill, when I'm getting on an airplane, in all honesty, if I see people who are dressed in Muslim garb, I feel anxious. It makes me nervous." I then went on to say, "But we cannot speak about Muslims in such a way as to encourage violence or stereotypes, despite the undeniable link between terrorism and extremist Islamic thinking. That, in fact, I'm a Christian, and I don't think that anybody would be right to leap to conclusions about Christians based on the behavior of Timothy McVeigh, the man who bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City. I don't think anybody would be right to leap to conclusions about Christians based on the behavior of the people at the Westboro Baptist Church who engage in those offensive rants against gay people at military funerals. In fact, as I'm speaking to today, I think they have plans to engage in some kind of protest even at the funeral of Steve Jobs. So I said all of this and made the point that I believe that America is based on a tenet of religious liberty, and that we as Americans have to protect that right so as not to encourage people such as that minister down in Florida who wanted to burn the Koran, or a man who had attacked a cab driver that he took to be Muslim because of his appearance and slashed his throat from behind. That we didn't want to encourage that kind of behavior. All of this was said at the time of a very real, spirited debate that was being broadcast live over the Fox News Channel. I went home after this segment of the show, this debate, without giving a thought to it. I had not thought that I had said anything provocative or rude or upsetting at all. The next day I flew to Chicago to give a speech. At the speech, several questions were about what I had said on the O'Reilly factor the night before, but it had nothing to do with anything about feeling nervous at airports. And that night, at O'Hare Airport, when I was coming home, a businessman stopped me as I was getting a slice of pizza, and he said that he had seen the show and he wanted to talk to me. I was in a rush to catch the plane, but in one of those moments where I'm a public person and I wasn't going to be rude to him, so I said, "Oh, well, what did you think? Why do you mention it?" And he explained that he is Muslim and that recently he had been in his home office and he was putting a letter and an envelope in a paper shredder when his 12-year-old walked into the room. And the 12-year-old said, "Dad, you're destroying that envelope and that letter because it has Arabic writing on it, and you don't want the neighbors to know that we're Muslim." And the father said, "Oh, no, it has the name of Allah on it, and you have to dispose of this envelope and this letter appropriately. You just don't throw this in with the rubbish." And he then explained to his son that he had no shame about being Muslim and asked why did he think that. And he said to me, he said, but what really stuck with him was the idea that his son felt stigmatized. Somehow his little boy had it in his mind that simply being Muslim was a problem with the neighbors. And he said that watching the discussion on TV the night before, it had reminded him that he needed to do more to change the image of Muslims in America, that he had to work to make it clear that most Muslims were not engaged in any terrorist activity. And he thanked me for what I had said. Again, no mention of any offensive statement. I went home that night. The next morning, I flew to New York. When I got off the plane, there was a phone call, and it was from a friend who works at an advocacy agency in Washington. And she said, "How are you? I see that you're under a lot of fire." I said, "For what?" And she said, "Oh, the office has all these emails calling for you to be fired from NPR for what you said on the O'Reilly show." And I said, "What are they talking about?" And she told me. I said, "Oh, well, don't worry about it. In my job as a political analyst for Fox, a news commentator, news analyst for NPR, people take shots at me every day. Believe me, it's either the Palestinians or the Israelis. It's blacks, it's whites, it's Republicans, Democrats. It's just the way it goes. Don't worry about it." And I went about my work that day at Fox, never giving it a second thought. But that evening, at around 5 o'clock, as I got off of one set and turned on my cell phone, I noticed that there was a call. It was from the head of the news division at National Public Radio, and I called back. And the first question was, "Did you mean what you said?" And I said, "Of course I meant what I said." And then I was told that I had made a bigoted comment that violated NPR's journalistic standards, that there were people who worked at NPR who wear Muslim garb, and that I had offended these people. And I said, "Are you kidding? Have I ever displayed any discriminatory behavior that would make you think that? And have you read the entirety of this transcript? Do you understand that I was standing up for religious liberty? Do you understand that what I said was the expression of a feeling, that I was not calling for any kind of discriminatory behavior?" And I was told that there was no need at all, that they had made a decision that was irrevocable. And I said, "Well, I've worked there 10 years. I was the host of Talk of the Nation, been the senior news correspondent, now working as a news analyst. And I said, I think we should go over this. I think we should talk about this face to face." And the response was, "There's nothing you can do, nothing you can say, no need for you to come in. We're terminating your contract. You're fired." I was stunned by this. I can't tell you how stunned I was, except to recount that after I hung up, I didn't know really what to do. I tried to reach my wife. As usual, I couldn't reach her. So I decided, I better just get my emails done because I had been working all day. So I went and answered some emails. And then I had some time, and I went to eat some Chinese food. Still couldn't reach my wife. And then returned to do a show that night, Sean Hannity's show at 9 o'clock. And it wasn't until I was walking off that set and Sean said to me, "Are you okay? Something seems wrong." And I thought he was talking about the show, and I said, no, everything's cool. And he said, "No, you seem upset." And I said, "Well, you know what happened today? I got fired." He said, "Fired from what?" I said, "Well, not from here, Sean. I got fired from NPR." And I explained it to him, and he immediately sat there and said, "Well, this is the craziest thing he ever heard of." And we made some calls to people. Bill Shine, one of the executives at Fox, woke him up, and he said, "Well, don't say anything about this until we have a discussion in the morning." But the minute that I turned my cell phone back on, there were calls from the New York Times, the Associated Press, NPR. NPR, it turns out, had leaked word of my firing with great excitement and pride at having dismissed their news analyst for what they termed a violation of NPR's journalistic standards, and again, people making the assumption that I had been labeled as a bigot. I was, again, just racked with fear about my career, my future, thinking no one would want to associate with someone that a much-loved brand like NPR was saying was an outlaw journalist who had engaged in an act of bigotry. I didn't know what to think was in store for me. And the next morning, as the calls and requests for interviews began to pour in, it was all the more concerned about it. By the following day, when I was leaving a hotel room in New York and opened the door and looked down at the stack of newspapers that were left there for me, I was looking at my face staring back at me on the USA Today and on the New York Times and on the Wall Street Journal. I thought, my God, what has happened? As I was saying in response earlier to the idea that Hugh suggested I've been here before to the City Club, you know, I thought, well, gosh, no book I've ever written has gotten this much attention. Nothing I've ever said as a journalist or work I've ever done as a journalist has put me in this position. But suddenly it was like, did I kill somebody? What happened here? Why is there this national response to what I had feared was a very personal loss of my reputation, loss of my job? But then as I began to experience this situation, and now it's almost a year since I've been fired, I came to understand that what had happened to me resonated deeply with the American people. That there were people who felt that they too can't say what's on their mind without fearing that they're going to be told to shut up, keep quiet, don't say that, you're a racist, you're a bigot, you're an idiot, you're a far right-winger, you're a crazy left-winger. You don't know what you're talking about. And then the consequences, that they would be marginalized, they would be ostracized, they would be told, you're not a good Republican. You're a Republican in name only. You're a rhino. Or you're not a good Democrat. You're a Democrat in name only, a dino. Or you know what? You're really not one of us. You don't understand. You're weak-kneed for being so anxious to talk with people on the other side. You lack spine. You're traitorous. Why are you even making inquiries or lending any support to arguments that would counter what we believe? And then I came to understand that there were people who were upset that so often in terms of American media, the media is grounded in provocateurs on the far right or the far left. That people find themselves living in an environment where if they open the Wall Street Journal editorial page, its views are so heavily slanted to the right. Or if they open the New York Times editorial page, the views are so heavily slanted to the left. And that people on the right would express alarm about the bias they see at NPR or in Hollywood movies, or that people on the left, people on the right, I should say, would express, people on the left, I should say, would express concern about the bias that they see coming from Hollywood in terms of the movies, or simply concern about what they take to be, liberal bias in so much of what Sarah Palin calls the lamestream media. That people feel as if they have to be boxed in, left or right, and that any time that they vary from established orthodoxies on the left or right, they find themselves in a no man's land, and that they are, again, ostracized or marginalized. This is a moment when America is going through a tremendous amount of change and challenge. The challenge, of course, in terms of our economic situation, a challenge, of course, in terms of rapid demographic shifts that are taking place in the country, change, of course, in terms of wave elections that we've seen in 2006 when Democrats took control of the House and Senate, in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected as a liberal senator from Illinois, first African American to be president of the United States, in 2010 when Republicans roared back with Tea Party-inspired fervor to recapture control of the House of Representatives. All of this represents a time of terrific turmoil and change in American life. There are so many pressing issues that require solutions. And yet, people feel that they have to bite their tongues, that they can't speak their minds without fear of being scolded and told to shut up, or as I said in my case, fired. This is a moment when people feel free to distort even the facts. Facts. A good example of this was Senator John Kyle in the midst of the argument over the budget and funding for Planned Parenthood, saying on the floor of the U.S. Senate, well, 90% of Planned Parenthood's activities are abortion-related. When reporters later went to the senator's office and said, well, Senator, that's not true. Only 10% of their monies are used on abortion-related activities, the senator said, well, he didn't mean it as a fact. It was Daniel Patrick Moynihan who said everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but not to their own set of facts. But in this environment, what we're seeing is that even the facts are in question. The facts can be so easily distorted. You stop and think about critical issues of this day and the impact they're having on the larger society. Immigration, terrorism, national security, deficit reduction, taxes. All of these issues are front and center in the public arena. And yet, the ability to have that honest discussion about them is so inhibited. And let me stop here and say that there are people who say, well, wait a second. We hear all sides, even the most extreme representations in American media, on websites, on the radio, all the time. What are you talking about? And I would add that if you look at the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Roberts, you have seen a tremendous affirmation of First Amendment rights. First Amendment rights, for example, in the case of the Westboro Baptist Church, that they have a right, even as odious as their representations may be, but they have a right to have their say at military funerals. First Amendment rights in terms of even the most violent video games. The court says those games have a right to be sold even to children. Even to children. And, First Amendment right, you can even make anonymous contributions to political campaigns as a function of your First Amendment free speech rights. So, again, you can hear the most wild-eyed ideas, the most offensive ideas in American media. So what am I talking about when I say that there is an assault on free and honest debate in this country today? Well, what I'm talking about, for example, would be the lack of honest debate with regard to immigration reform in this country. Here's an issue, immigration reform, that is so critical at this time when America is experiencing a rush of immigrants unlike, well, there's only one other time in American history at the start of the last century when we've seen as high a percentage of immigrants in the nation as we are experiencing today. But of course, 100 years ago, we were a much smaller country. Today, as a country of more than 300 million people, the 15% of Americans who are born in other lands are coming from around the globe as part of a global economic structure. 100 years ago, the immigrants that were coming to this land were coming here largely from places in Western Europe, Germany, Italy, Ireland, Great Britain. They were occupying the cities up and down the East Coast, seaboard, coming to places like Cleveland, forming strong ethnic communities, but intent on assimilation. Today, the immigrants that are coming come not only from Mexico, although that is a large source of the immigrants, but from Asia, from Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, newly independent republics of the former Soviet Union. And they come here as so-called hyphenated Americans. They are creating a structure that's quite a challenge to American identity and leading to real issues. You can see some of this playing out in Arizona. Oftentimes it's discussed in terms of illegal immigrants, but the fact is that Americans, especially older white Americans, are quite discomforted by the presence of so many people who don't speak English, people standing there listening to Spanish-speaking radio or turning on cable and discovering there are channels there for people from China, people from Nigeria, going down, as I said, to the 7-Eleven and the gas station and other places and thinking, you know, is this the America that I grew up in? It's a tremendous, tremendous challenge. In addition, just in terms of the illegal immigrant population, 12 to 13 million people in the country without proper documentation. Tremendous issue. President George W. Bush, with the support of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, tried to address this issue, but found that there were people, especially conservative talk show hosts, who said anybody who's talking about immigration reform is actually engaged in trying to grant amnesty to lawbreakers, to criminals. And then there was rhetoric about anchor babies and terror babies, illegal immigrants coming into the country and having children or bringing children across the border illegally. And we know, if you've recently watched the Republican debates, that when Governor Perry of Texas said that he believed in the idea of allowing illegal immigrant children to have in-state tuition so that they can get an education, people on the far right viewed this as a total rejection of their values and their position, their hard line on immigration reform. Now, that's the conversation among Republicans, and it has been paralyzed. President Bush was unable to get anything done. A younger Democrat, President Obama, came along and said he was going to get immigration reform accomplished in this country. But what we've seen is that as President Obama has tried to raise the issue, the high level of rhetoric, the partisanship, the lack of honest conversation has persisted. And that even with Democratic majorities in the House and Senate, he was unable to reach any solution to this critical issue for us as Americans. Again, there has been no action on immigration reform. Or stop for a second and think about what's been going on in terms of arguments over the high level of debt that the nation holds. We continually come to the brink of economic catastrophe. In fact, we have lowered confidence in the American economy, resulting in higher bond ratings because lack of honest discussion. Republicans are unwilling to discuss increased revenue or tax hikes as part of any compromise to resolve the debt issue. Democrats reluctant to discuss anything in terms of entitlement reform, even as entitlements such as Medicare and Social Security are on the brink of financial collapse. So what we get, hard lines that leave most Americans scratching their heads and saying, you know, even in a relationship, even in marriage, there is compromise. But in the current atmosphere, compromise has become a dirty word, evidence of weakness, lack of principle. It's unbelievable. Unbelievable, and it's why so many Americans now say that when it comes to American leadership in the Congress, they have no faith. Only 6% of Americans give a positive rating to the U.S. Congress at this moment. Or how about the discussion regarding national security? President Obama's team comes into office and they decide that they are no longer going to use the term terrorism because they think that it's off-putting and maybe threatening to people in the Islamic world. They want to be very clear. So instead, President Obama and Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano begin to use the term man-made disasters. What a euphemism for terrorism. As if it's fooling anybody, as if anybody is thinking, oh, well, that's not a discussion about terrorism. It is an open lie. But again, this is the kind of lack of forthright discussion that Americans know now is a reality in our world. How often do we see, just in terms of this discussion about terrorism, euphemism, lies, and evasion? How is it possible for me as a journalist not to understand that it was terrorist, extremist Muslims who cut the throat of Daniel Pearl, a Wall Street Journal journalist, doing his job? How is it that I'm supposed to ignore, as a journalist, as someone who's made documentaries, the idea that Theo Van Gogh made a documentary about how women are treated in Muslim societies and was murdered for that act? How am I, as a journalist, supposed to ignore that in my own country there's a political cartoonist, Molly Norris, who suggested, you know what? We draw caricatures even of Jesus Christ in the United States. Why can't we draw a caricature of Muhammad? But because she suggested to her fellow political cartoonists that they engage in a Draw Muhammad Day, she was bombarded with death threats, and as I'm speaking to you, Molly Norris is in hiding for fear of her life. How am I, as a journalist, not to interpret that as a chilling curtailment of free speech in America? How am I supposed to not notice that when the playwright Tony Kushner was nominated for an honorary degree in New York City, one of the board members said, but no, Tony Kushner has had critical comments about Israeli policy regarding the Palestinians, and had the honorary degree taken away. It was only when the news hit the papers about this decision, and people said, well, wait a second, Tony is Jewish and a stalwart supporter of Israel, that the board then had to shamefacedly reverse their decision. But again, the idea is, if you're part of our group, if you're standing with us, then you have to agree with us about everything. And so what's happening is the far left, the far right, people who have any one set position, advocates of any one political argument in our society, tend to set the tone for the debate, the language for the debate, declare what is off limits, what is offensive, and in some cases, what is evidence of bigotry, racism, with the idea being that they would silence your voice, that you, even living in America under the First Amendment, would absolutely be muzzled. Muzzled. To me, this is a critical issue for all of us, and it's why I'm so pleased to be here for this discussion today. Because it's a discussion that has led, or lack of discussion, I should say, that has led to so many Americans simply going to websites, to TV shows, to radio shows, to publications, newspapers, magazines, that affirm pre-existing opinions, to personalities that are reliably conservative or reliably liberal as their touchstones, understanding that they are not allowed to engage in the act of inquiry, discussion, and debate with the idea that they should be free to learn, to change positions, to refine their stand, and maybe most incredibly of all, that they should be open to the idea of compromise, an idea that gave birth, of course, not only to our Declaration of Independence, but to our Constitution and to those very important First Amendment rights that we hold in such high regard as a great American privilege. All of this, the work of compromise and smart people engaged in honest debate. But what we see taking place now, again, is an orthodoxy setting in and leading to paralysis. Paralysis that leads people to feel they can't say what's on their mind. That leads people like that minister in Florida to decide that he is going to act out because no one else is talking about the impact of terrorism and its link to the Islamic world, that he's going to act in such a way as to offend Muslims by burning the Quran. This, to me, is just the tip of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg in terms of the lack of honest conversation that leads people to have such low confidence in American leadership, that leads so many Americans to fear for the future of the society. And I would hope that we would understand that when Congresswoman Gabby Giffords was shot, and so many people expressed concerns about extremist thought, they were actually late to the game, in which Congresswoman Giffords had already said that anybody who's an honest politician these days, anybody who is trying to seek out compromise on the most polarizing of issues, whether it's immigration, abortion, gun control, anybody who's trying to understand how we can fashion solutions is treated as an outsider and an idiot and given no reward. But that politicians who are at the far extremes, people who would stand up and shout, "You lied" to the president in the course of a debate about health care reform, those politicians are rewarded with a sudden increase in funding. Those politicians are rewarded with a sudden increase in their web traffic and people who are now lending support and activists who want to come and campaign for them. That's the reality of the America we live in. And TV and radio and newspapers know that if they cater, or maybe I should say pander, to either the far left or the far right, they have a reliable base of viewers, listeners, or readers. But if they are trying to determine and inquire about facts for those of us in the middle, they're not sure that they can count on that audience to be there every day. And the result, again, is so much pandering to the far left and the far right. So we have advocacy groups, we have media, we have politicians, we have an entire structure now that enforces a lack of free and honest debate in the society. And today, as we gather for this very important conversation, I hope that we do not lose sight of the need to start rewarding people, politicians, people in media, people across the board who are willing to listen, willing to engage in honest conversation, willing to express their feelings, all in search of real ideas that can lead to real solutions to our real problems. Thank you very much. Good job. Thank you very much. You get to go over here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. And I'll remind folks that you can tweet questions to # free speech CLE. So fire away on those. And we're also going to take questions from the crowd here live. I want to first just go to a tweeted question that we've had a few here. Ron Van John asks, Mr. Williams, so is there a difference between a journalist and an analyst, or are these now effectively blended, in your view?
Well, I think there's a difference between someone who's a news analyst and someone who's a correspondent. I think correspondents clearly have limits in terms of what they can say and what they can do. Their job is to deliver for their audience the facts, you know, who, what, where, when, why, how, that kind of thing. But someone who is a news analyst, I believe, has a greater amount of latitude to express opinion. That certainly was my understanding of my job at NPR. It's certainly part of my job at Fox News. To suddenly say that I'm not allowed to express an opinion, much less a feeling, seems to me to be directly contradictory. And I think it's an important distinction to be made. Again, there's a difference between a reporter or a correspondent and someone who's an opinion journalist.
Dave?
Mr. Williams, in light of your personal experience, imagine for a second that you're the head of ESPN. Would you have yanked Hank Williams Jr.'s theme song from Monday Night Football in light of his comments last week? If so, why? If not, why not? And I assume he's not related to you.
Well, you know, I love my old daddy. No, he's not related to me at all. I find the use of the N-word highly offensive to me. I think it's dehumanizing. And I think in the political terms that Hank Williams Jr. made some analogy between Hitler and President Obama was also highly offensive and intended to belittle the president and dehumanize him. There is no substance to that analogy. There is no basis on which you would say that the behavior of the current American president is in any way similar to the behavior of the man who engineered such a Holocaust and such an attempt at world domination. It's just absurd. And I think that if ESPN, ABC, that entire business enterprise, feels that he was damaging their brand and their relationship with their audience and detracting from Monday Night Football and from creating a problem for advertisers, they have every right to let him go. But I think it's important to distinguish that kind of provocative, intentionally offensive statement from people who simply want to engage in honest debate, honest discussion, and tell you what's on their mind. I do not think that he was opening the door to honest discussion, debate. I think he was closing and shutting down a door by attempting to demonize the president.
We're going to try to alternate with Cyberland here. So Joe Simperman has tweeted, "So, Mr. Williams, do you support the defunding of NPR by the U.S. Congress, yes or no?"
Yes, and I tell you why. I think that for the longest time I stayed away from this whole topic, Hugh, because I feared that people would say, oh, it's sour grapes, or he's being vindictive and mean-spirited, and he's the same guy who was out there raising money all the time for NPR. The stations would call, they ask various NPR personalities to come and host events for NPR listeners and to talk to corporate executives who might, again, contribute. And I was certainly enthusiastic in raising money for NPR all these years. But about 3 months after I was fired, in the course of Republican attempts to cut NPR funding out of the federal budget, there was a letter put out by Steve Israel, a Democratic congressman from New York, running the Democratic Congressional Committee, saying, you know, we have to stop these Republicans from attempting to defund NPR because NPR is our answer to Rush Limbaugh. And at that moment it occurred to me, wait a second, so if an NPR journalist says something that's not to the liking of the Democrats, oh my gosh, the Democrats are now going to be upset because the Democrats have been the great protectors. I said, you know what, this is an untenable position for an American journalist. You shouldn't be pleasing one political party or another. You shouldn't be anybody's defense. You should be free to report the news without any kind of bias. And NPR gets, I believe, according to their own accounting, only 1 or 2% of their money directly from the federal government. I think it's a little higher if you look at what money flows through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. But I don't think that there's any problem that such a highly respected brand as NPR would have in getting money from advertisers or getting money from their own subscribers and listeners to continue funding NPR. Certainly the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, other major media organizations don't have that problem, and I think it would eliminate those who think that NPR is biased to one side or another, or the kind of silliness that then was revealed when a journalist or some kind of renegade journalist then secretly videotaped NPR fundraisers making offensive comments. Again, the people pretended to be from the Muslim Brotherhood or something, and then they were making offensive comments about Jews, and certainly, again, putting me down and saying it was so right to label me a bigot and fire me, all in search of trying to get, funding from this group. And then, of course, they were on tape looking foolish, and that led to the president of NPR resigning.
So, Joe, that was a yes.
Yeah, I said right off the top.
Wherever
yes.
you are. Over here.
Mr. Williams, do you think that the social and psychological dimensions of consumer culture and the predominance of applying the business model to everything from government to education, and including the idea of marketing and branding and everything, is partly responsible for this polarization of views and simplification of everything into clear, easy to identify kinds of categories?
Well, and honestly, I hadn't thought of this before. I mean, what's obvious to me, as I said in my remarks here this morning, is that we live in this niche media culture. And to the extent that it relates to branding and to the sort of capitalistic instinct, if you will, in putting people in boxes that are easily identified, this appeals to advertisers because advertisers want to know who's in this audience and what does this audience want. So you'll note that if you're watching a lot of news programming, they tend to be for older people. And the news programs know that's the bulk of that audience. Again, they want to know and do know who's watching MTV or who's watching the Cartoon Network. They're able, therefore, to really hone in and not waste their time with people who are unlikely to consume their products. So we have this very niche landscape, and of course it attaches to political stripes as well, left and right. It attaches even in racial terms, black, white, Hispanic, all of it. and it breaks down, it fragments so much of the media. And the result is that, again, it enforces a clubhouse type of mentality. You're part of our group or you're not part of our group. And if you stray away to hear other points of view, you can easily then be labeled as unfaithful or traitors. So it's interesting to me that you make this cultural connection. I hadn't made it, but I think in terms of looking at the business model for, this niche media landscape I've described, I think it's very real. I said to someone the other day, I said, when I was growing up, I used to watch Walter Cronkite, and I thought the world of Walter Cronkite. I didn't say, now there's a liberal or there's a conservative. I didn't say there's a white man, a black man. I said, well, no, actually, I think that guy's a highly credible, trustworthy source of news, a terrific journalist. And even in terms of his expression of emotion, I remember when there was a tragedy in space, and there was Cronkite, or the assassination of President Kennedy. So I thought to myself, in the current media landscape, Walter Cronkite would not succeed. He would fail because he wasn't sufficiently large a personality, and people are drawn, if you look at where people get their news today, to these large personalities that identify themselves clearly, that fit into the boxes, the cultural boxes that you're talking about with branding, that allow the advertisers to know exactly what they're getting. And what you see is decreasing audience for the nightly news shows that try to appeal to the general audience. You see publications like U.S. News, Newsweek basically going away. Again, you look at the web. What succeeds is specific websites that appeal to specific, easily identifiable audiences. And this leads to this clubhouse mentality, but it does work very well for advertisers because they know exactly who they're talking to.
Sure. Is that Charles?
Mr. Williams, you spoke several times about, on the one hand, the far right, and on the other hand, the far left. I think we can all identify a half a dozen or more very prominent voices on the far right, both in the political and the media landscapes. Who exactly are you referring to on the far left that is making a comparable amount of noise?
Gosh, I don't have much trouble with this one. I mean, have you watched MSNBC?
And you think there's an equivalent there?
Do I think they're an equivalent?
Yeah.
To what?
In terms of noise, in terms of
Oh, yeah. I mean,
speech.
I think if you're saying, look, this is what I said in the course of the speech. If you're on the right and you look at MSNBC and you look at the ideologues that they have there throughout the whole prime time slate, you'd say, my God, what is I mean, do they make any attempt at balance here? What's going on? If you're on the right and you're reading the editorial page in the New York Times, you're saying, what is going on here? Why is this so one-sided? If you are on the right and you are watching most Hollywood movies and you're looking at Hollywood moguls who are giving money to political, you're saying, well, this is basically they're funding the left in this country. And they are promoting left-wing values and ideals.
Are you suggesting that the New York Times belongs to the far left, that Hollywood belongs to the far left?
I don't think there's any question. If we're talking about the New York Times editorial page as opposed to the news columns.
And you would say that's far left?
Oh, I think some people would say that they're not sufficiently left-wing. If they're a far left-winger, they say, oh, they're too moderate. But believe me, if you're looking at it from the right, yes, you would say it's far left.
Well, I would suggest that you're polarizing yourself.
All right, next question.
Okay.
Mr. Williams, thank you for being here. And I'm hoping you can address the solutions. We understand the problem. You pointed it out. And certainly, I have a bit of a conflict because it seems that you are participating in the problem by being part of Fox News, which is the right. And then I agree, MSNBC is as bad on the left. But you're participating in this. So what is the solution? I mean, do you have a conflict with what you do yourself? And then what is the solution to this problem?
No, I've heard this question before. But to me, the fact that Fox has me there constantly challenging people on the right is evidence that not only do the executives at Fox value a different point of view, but that the audience is open to hearing and values hearing a different set of representations about what they're being told. And again, this is with the primetime personalities, people like Hannity, that are easily identified as clearly far right wing. And there I am arguing, sometimes very loudly, with their leading personalities. So to me, this is evidence of the kind of debate that I think we should have in American society. As people say to me when I'm walking through airports or at basketball and baseball games, they say, "Thank God you're there. Thank God someone's challenging them. Thank God somebody else is on that stage." So to me, what's critical is that we need to enlarge the space for people who really don't want all the partisanship, who don't want to be told you have to fit in the box. The question is, how do we do it? In the course of trying to promote this book, I was on Jon Stewart. And Jon Stewart said something to me that sticks with me. He said, "You know, Fox is so very successful. It's the #1 cable news channel in the United States." And he just admires so many of the production values. He thinks it's fun to watch, it's sexy to watch, it's interesting, it's intense to watch. You resist hitting the channel change because something's going on. It's live, it has that energy. He said, but how do we do that? How do we translate that into something that's not based so much in terms of partisan position? How do we establish something where there's a higher level, the audience could have a higher level of trust? Again, during those primetime hours is what I'm discussing. How could the audience have a higher level of trust and say, hey, this is exciting, sexy, fun, I enjoy watching it, not feel like they're eating, pea soup or swallowing cod liver oil, but, say, hey, I want to watch, I want to see what's going on. How do we create that program? And I get that from people all over. They ask me, where do I get my news? How do you get news that's not tilted one way or the other and that's trustworthy? And, at the moment, my answer is that you've got to have a balanced media diet. You've got to look everywhere to make sure you're getting the entirety of the universe of facts. But I think there's a hunger in the American mind right now for media that would, in fact, be less partisan, more coherent in terms of making the case for what could be trustworthy or credible news.
Thank you so much.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.